Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppy. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. Poppy is spelled Poppie. At my website, you can find my book, The Ninth Hour. It is the first book in a fantasy adventure series, but it isn't fantasy. Just read it and you'll figure it out. Or you can check out my serialized novel, One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet. That is more of a testing the waters of how I write to see whether you like what I'm doing or whether you like what I'm doing. That's what I see that as. So check that out. It is a little different than the book itself. I am currently writing chapter 16, and it's going well. I like it, and I think if you are writing something like a serialized novel like I'm doing, I think there's you have to set the stage when writing a book, right? There's this idea that you have to show people what the stasis is, and then you lead them through the book. There's changes that happen in the book. Then you get to the end of the book, and there's a new stasis. There's a new normal at the end of the book. Well, I'm getting to the point where there's a lot of stuff picking up, and I thought I was going to extend this story quite a ways, right? Have it over a longer period of time, and then have spaces of time between each of these periods. Not like years, but a significant amount of time. And right now, as I'm writing the 16th chapter, I'm pushed to write things happening right up against one another because of the fact that I'm trying to make it interesting in every single chapter. You don't have to have extreme excitement in every single chapter to make a book good, and we know that because there's so many books that aren't extreme excitement. And if you do have extreme excitement in every single chapter, it becomes static, right? Everything is the same every single chapter, so you think, there's no buildup. This happens a lot with newer movies that I've noticed. There's a lot of action throughout the entire movie. Looking at you, Transformers, and then you get to the end, and you're like, well, yeah, everything built up. Everything was action-packed, but there was no build-up to that action. And a few months ago, or weeks ago, or something like that, because I don't actually know the time period that I exist in anymore. I just kind of exist in this present that there's all this memory of what I did yesterday and the day before and the month before and the month before that. That's all piled up, and it seems like it's all yesterday. A few months ago, or a few weeks ago, I can't really remember, I watched the Rocky movies over again. And what I noticed in the first movie is that the majority of that movie is build up, right? There's all that tension being built. You can say what you want about that movie, but it certainly does not, it's not that nothing happens in the first, majority of the movie, in the first 90% of the movie, but it all builds up to that final fight at the end, and the final fight lasts about 10-15 minutes at the most. So it builds up to that, and then you get to the climax, and you have to make that climax excellent. And with my serialized novel, I've noticed that there is a push in how I'm writing it to continue to keep that excitement, keep that pressure up, and I have ideas to do that, but at the same time, it's like, well, should I or should I not? And I think there's a place for having a lot of excitement in each chapter, and there's a place for slowing down to help build that tension. It just depends on where you are. Check those out at my website. Our word of the week is tawdry. I didn't know what this was before today. Tawdry is showy but cheap and of poor quality. And I would assume if something is cheap in this sense, it is of poor quality, but we need to have that modifier on there so we have a complete and clear understanding of what this is. So tawdry, showy but cheap and of poor quality. Again, I did not actually know what that word meant before today. Even I don't know everything. Just 99% of everything. We are going back to our discussion about history, and half of you are asleep. The other half are like, this is great because I love history and that's how it is. 2 weeks ago, we talked about how children are naive, and you can convince children to do things or young people to do things easier than older people in general. Last week, I talked about how we see history as this experiment, right? We look back at history, we can see how people did things, we can see whether that worked or not. If we know history better, we can match our own time period or our own lives to history or other people's lives and see whether this is going to work out for us. Like I said before, at the end of that episode, if you are someone who is looking for life advice, you might want to take someone someone's life advice with a grain of salt if their life has been wildly different than your own life, right? For example, if you are someone who's born into poverty, and you're looking at the advice from someone who has been born into the upper class, like the legitimate upper class, not just they're not just rich, they're blue bloods, right? If you're looking at someone, if you're looking at advice from that person, you might want to take some of it with a grain of salt. You should always look at advice and determine whether it's good advice or not, but they have a very different life experience than you, right? And they might have found things work in their lives just because they have connections that don't work for you. So that's how I ended it. And we are looking at history, or we are looking at these experiments that have been done throughout history. We found that certain things are better than others, right? There's certain things within our lives that are better to do than others. There's certain things that are better to do than others in our society in general. Some things we're still testing out, right? There's certain things that I would say we're still in the process of testing out. And it doesn't mean these things are bad. It doesn't mean these things are good. It just means we're testing them out because it's so new. For example, how should we interact with digital technology like computers, like this, for example? What should we do with our lives? I have a phone. I carry a smartphone around every single day. It's in my pocket, not 24/7, but it's in my pocket the majority of my waking day. I'm attached to that. And I use it very often. You know, people used to listen to the radio. I listen to things on my phone. And it's similar to just listening to the radio like people would do all day. But we are testing out how to interact with that and what the best way is and what's going to harm us, right? In a way, we're testing out family dynamics at this time in history. We're testing out whether different structures in families work than it has traditionally been the case. We're testing out whether you can have split homes. That's something newer. It's not completely new, but we're testing it out to see if it works. We're testing out whether you can have the same gender raising children and seeing how that's working. We don't have enough data to see whether that's better or worse. Or maybe there are some people with data to see whether it's better or worse or just the same. But we are testing it out because it's really never happened, at least in the past, probably since the beginning of the Common Era, Auto Domini. So before since the beginning of the ADs. I don't know what you call that, actually. And I don't know if there's ever been a country that has had gay marriage, right? So we are testing that out. We're testing out a lot of different things. We're testing out how people can interact online, whether it works to have so many people connected to so many people. We're actually testing out a huge percentage of the population college educated, because the majority of people my age went to college, and we're going to see in 20 years, 25 years, whether, or even less, probably about 20 years, whether those people's kids are going to go to college themselves or not, because this whole generation went to college. I know there's a lot of people who have a lot of debt who are like, this didn't really work out for me. So they're determining whether they should give their kids advice of whether they should go to college. People who are 40 years and up who have gone to college say it's essential. And I think that a lot of people my age and a lot of people younger are seeing that, maybe this isn't the best course of action, especially right out of high school. Now, it's not denigrating certain degrees. It's not denigrating college. It's not denigrating college necessarily. It's more saying that it doesn't work the way that so many people said it was going to work. Okay? So many things we're testing out in the present day that we're going to see in 20, 25 years, whether that actually works. And certain things right now are being pushed against that are newer that we're saying maybe this actually doesn't work. When we look at history, we are trying to understand history, and we're trying to understand it completely. We're trying to understand it fully, because if we don't understand it fully, we don't have enough information, or we don't understand the nuances of it, we may take it and apply it to certain situations incorrectly. One thing that I see a lot right now, so if you're watching this in the future, I live in the United States. Donald Trump is the president. We're going through the impeachment things right now, so you'll have 20/20 hindsight, and you can see how that went. You can determine how I'm thinking right now and whether my assessment of the situation is correct. So right now we're going through that, and one thing that I've heard, and it hasn't come up recently, but in the beginning of Trump's presidency, there were a lot of people comparing the United States to Nazi Germany, specifically not Nazi Germany itself, but Weimar Germany. If you don't know what Weimar Germany is, or Weimar, if we want to actually bring it into, we want to Anglicanize it. Now I can't remember what the word is. So if we want to bring it into the English language, we're going to call it Weimar Germany, and that was the Germany before Hitler came to power. This was the Germany primed so that Hitler could come to power, right? And there's a lot of people, last year, I think the year before, at the beginning of Trump's presidency, who were saying, hey, this is looking a lot like Weimar Germany. This is looking a lot like someone who is in a situation who's going to come to power, who's going to do a lot of really, really bad things. So there were a lot of people comparing Trump to Hitler, all right? And there were a lot of people comparing Trump and the United States in general to Germany at that time, okay? First of all, my favorite thing to come out of that is people saying Trump is literally Hitler, and because you're all writers, you realize that's not true, because literally means that Trump would actually be Hitler. So Hitler would have somehow had to survive, so maybe Hitler made it to South America after all. And then he is still alive, even though I think he'd be like 110 years old, maybe 105. I don't know how, I think he'd be 110, something like that. Maybe even older, if I'm doing the math correctly. Maybe he'd be like 120 years old. He comes to the United States. He dresses up as Trump during the 70s, So he's masquerading as Trump. He's building his real estate stuff. He's doing his apprentice stuff on TV. And then he is like, I'm gonna try this political thing out again. Let's run to be the president. So if that happened, he would literally be Hitler. I don't think that happened. I don't think anybody thinks it's happened. But I think the funniest thing coming out of that is, well, there's a lot of funny things coming out of the United States in general, politically. But the funniest thing coming out of that is people saying that he was literally Hitler, because that's not actually the case. He's literally Trump. He'd be figuratively Hitler. So people are saying, or there have been people saying, oh, he's just like Hitler in the United States. This is just like Weimar Germany. We're headed down a really bad path. Now, I've been reading more about Hitler's rise to power, and I've been reading more about how Germany was at the time. And if you look at Germany and if you study into this, and I'm not trying to make a political statement one way or the other. So I'm trying to keep this non-political, because I don't want to, this is a writing podcast. It's not a political podcast. It's not meant to try to sway you in a political direction. There's so many people talking about politics. Go to their podcast. I'm just talking about understanding history, and I'm talking about, one thing I've noticed that I think is a misunderstanding of history, okay? And this specific idea that the United States is like Weimar Germany, and we're going to go down this path where we turn into this totalitarian state, I think it's a very bad misread of the present day and of history. So I think that the people who are saying this, and if you are someone who's saying this, I'm not saying this to try to be mean to you. I'm not trying to say this to offend you or attack you. I think it's a misread of what's going on at the present day. And I'll just explain why I think that's the case. And I think that it's not like Weimar Germany. And even if you think Trump is pretty much Hitler, right? Even if you think he's literally Hitler, I don't think that the United States is in a situation where something like Germany could happen, because the United States, the present day, the history of the United States, how it's run, how the government is set up, how the people are, is very different than Germany was at the time. All right. So here's a few things. And if you're someone who is really into history and has studied this a lot, you're going to probably have a little bit of a different read about this. I get a lot of this information from the rise and fall of the Third Reich. So it might be some information that is contested within the historical field. Like they're saying, we don't actually think that this is correct, even though this was the definitive historical book on the rise and fall of Nazism, essentially. So if there is some information you disagree with from a historical perspective because you're a history junkie, that is my source primarily that I'm drawing from for this stuff. And it's a hefty tome. It's a really interesting read. So if you ever want to check it out, definitely read it. But yeah, so I was reading this, and Trump became the president. I started reading this shortly after. And I started looking at this, and people were saying, oh, this is just like Weimar Germany. And I was looking at what Germany was, their history, the history of the German people and Germany prior to Weimar Germany. If you don't know, Germany, I think it was the late 1800s, they were all these German states. There was Prussia, I believe, Hesse, these different German states that conglomerated into Germany itself. And Germany became a world power almost overnight. I don't know if Hesse was one of them, but there's all these little German states. There's these German-speaking people, and they decide, we're going to be one state. And I think it happened in the late, 1880 or something like that, sometime around the late 1800s. And then, so Germany itself, how it is as a state, is actually fairly new. It's not a very old state, but the people, you'd say the people group there has been there a very long time. So when you look at Germany, Germany is specifically, there's this idea brought up that the Nazi tradition is actually a Prussian tradition. So Prussia, as understood historically, was it's northeast. I believe it's a northeastern state in Germany, and it was a very iron-fisted, not dictatorship, but how it was ruled throughout history prior to Germany becoming a state itself. It was a very iron-fisted, and in Europe there were many people during the Middle Ages who were peasants, and they were tied to the land, so they were serfs. So what serfs are is that they're kind of like slaves. It depends on where you are, and some have more rights than others, but they were tied to the land. They were more like slaves to the land rather than people. So if land exchanged hands, the serfs went along with them. Well, in Prussia, the serfdom was more slave than free at the time, so there was a lot of iron-fisted rule. And what happened with Prussia is, and if you think back to Germany during World War II, this looks a lot like Germany. What Prussia did is they did a lot of they had an army, and they took over a lot of people militarily, and then they grew their empire like that, and they held it together in that way rather than through diplomacy or through marrying people and different things like that, or through buying land. They did it militarily, and they held power over these people in a more iron-fisted way, right? So there is that history of Prussia. There's that brutal history that comes out in Nazism. You see, it was a brutal movement. It really was, and it encouraged people to be very vicious in a way at the same time. And there's no the United States. You might disagree with a lot of things the United States has done. You might disagree with. You might say the United States has done evil in the past, but the United States doesn't have a specific history of enslaving its own population and then controlling its own population with like a military power in that way, okay? So you might say, oh, the United States enslaved other people. People in the United States had slaves, or they attacked different groups of people or different things like that, but it wasn't enslaving its own population. The population that was free in the United States, which was the majority of the population throughout its history, was allowed to be free and allowed to have a lot of liberties. And it's a good thing, of course, that more and more people have been brought under that umbrella of liberty, having freedom in the United States, having rights in the United States. And I think you'd have a hard time finding people who actually thought that way. Another thing that happened in Germany right before Hitler came to power was an economic depression. So the Great Depression happened, right? If you look at history and you look at historical photos from the past, what you notice is there's these pictures of marks. That's their currency in Germany, lining the streets. It's kind of insane. You see people with wheelbarrows full of currency, full of the German mark. And the wheelbarrow full was enough to buy like a loaf of bread. We haven't had a situation like that in the United States, well, since the same period of time, since the Depression, right? We did have a recession in 2008. We had the housing market crisis, but people weren't freaking out. People, like, you probably had some people lose their homes, but at the same time, you could still buy things with like a limited amount of currency. You didn't have to have wheelbarrows full. There wasn't hyperinflation. There isn't hyperinflation in the United States like there was in Germany at the time. And I believe that hyperinflation was actually due to the government messing around with things at the time. I'm not positive about that. But so you have the brutal control that the Prussian state had over its group of people, the northeastern Germany, that section of Germany. And the reason why that's important is because Hitler and the Nazis kind of carried those ideas into Nazism. Okay, it doesn't mean that I guess you couldn't take those Nazi ideas and incorporate it into something in the United States, but this is part of how a group of people in Germany actually worked, what they did. The guy who wrote the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, his assessment of it essentially was that the Nazism isn't a phenomenon. It wasn't an anomaly, in Germany. It was more of a continuation of how things were done in the Prussian state. So we don't have that. We didn't have an economic depression. We did not have a huge loss in World War I, right? World War I happened before. Hitler even fought in World War I. And they had a really unfair treaty, right? They essentially forced Germany to pay all this money, these reparations for the war. Debts for the war, and it destroyed Germany in a way. And all the people in Germany had this bitterness toward the other nations around them, right? We're not in that same situation in the United States. Some people might argue that some people in the United States have bitterness toward immigrants, but I don't think it's the same thing. Okay, because on a whole scale, Germany was defeated, and then they were humiliated afterward by a different country that had their same power as themselves, a greater power than themselves, right? Because they were defeated, therefore, if they're being defeated, that other power was stronger to be able to defeat them in some capacity. So they were I wouldn't say they were pushed by other countries to do this, but if someone beats you up and then takes all your money, that's going to be pretty difficult. The United States isn't being attacked by Mexico. It isn't being conquered by Mexico. But say, for example, that a whole bunch of countries came in, they attacked the United States. Tons and tons of young men died. Everybody had this very cynical view of the world around them, and at the same time, the group of nations that attacked the United States made the United States pay exorbitant amounts of money to their countries as payback for whatever reason. Besides these things, there is this idea of a German homeland. So Germany. There are multiple different countries surrounding Germany. There were multiple different areas that were German-speaking, and there was this specific idea, especially within the Nazi Party, but I think it was more widespread in Germany at the time, that the German people should be united. So there's multiple different countries that speak English, but there isn't this idea that the English world should be united. I think that the English-speaking countries have good relations with one another in general, but I don't think that they think, oh, we should all be one country. Now, I think that partially has to do with this idea that these countries were so geographically localized around Germany. So Austria is a German-speaking country, and actually there was a time when that whole area was part of one kingdom. And then you also have an area in Czechoslovakia that eventually became part of Nazi Germany that was taken into Nazi Germany, and then Hitler used that as a jumping off point to essentially get rid of Czechoslovakia at that time in history. Another thing that was the case then, because we don't have this idea that, oh, we should have all these different English-speaking countries be a part of the United States. The United States at this time in history doesn't think, oh, we should see Canada. Canada is a big English-speaking country. We are all English speakers. We're not English, but we're all English speakers. Therefore, we should all be a part of an English-speaking country. And the United States doesn't have that idea that we should take over Canada because Canada is an English-speaking country. Besides that, there were multiple world power nodes. So Germany had a lot of power. There was Britain. You had Russia. Besides Russia, you had France as well. And then Japan also. In the Far East, you had Japan. The United States as well. I think I didn't say the United States. So there wasn't one central power. So the United States is the superpower that exists at this time in the world. At that time, there were different powers vying for different there were different powers vying at that time when there were different countries vying for power, and they were to a certain degree equal in power, and they could attack each other. At this time in history, in our time in history, the United States is the power. If the United States decided to go to war against another country, the United States would almost inevitably win, right? Even if it was a bigger country, even if it was Russia, the United States, I think at this time, every other country combined doesn't have the aircraft carriers of the United States. I think the United States aircraft carriers are in the teens. It might be about around 10. No other country has one, right? The United States blows away the firepower of the other countries in the world, I think combined. So it might be very difficult to attack the United States. You might be arguing, oh, that means that if somebody got to power in the United States, they could go and they could do whatever they wanted, right? At the same time, the United States doesn't really feel threatened by another country. They don't think, oh, this is someone who's against us, who they're going to attack us. And there was this idea in Germany at the time that, they felt beat up. They were beat up because of the First World War. They to a certain degree, there was a sense that we want to get even with these other countries. So that was going through Germany. I heard this idea recently that a Hitler doesn't just happen either. Hitler says something, and then people actually need to react positively to what Hitler is saying for Hitler to gain power, for Hitler to continue on and to become the dictator of Germany and lead people to a war against essentially the whole entire world. One thing that isn't the case for the United States, or I guess this is something that maybe somebody would argue is the case, but I would say it isn't the case, and I'll explain why it isn't the case. So at that time, Russia was a superpower. Russia was very powerful. Russia had a lot of impact in the world, and Germany, Hitler went behind everybody else's back. He talked to Stalin. And he's like, hey, I won't attack you if you won't attack me. And there was this idea that he would go into Poland, he would take over Poland, and Russia and Germany would split Poland in half. So Germany would take half of it, Russia would take half of it. They'd be like, oh, this is great, and we're all good. And then Russia isn't going to war with Germany. There isn't a powerful, malevolent force in the world today like Russia was in the past. Some people might argue that Russia is that malevolent force in the world, but Russia is not... Compared to the United States, Russia is not as powerful as the United States. The United States would not need Russia to do something bad in the world. The United States would have enough power to do it bad by themselves, right? So there isn't this malevolent power that Trump can go to and say, oh, we need help in this direction. The United States has enough power by themselves. So that's something you might argue, but that the whole Russian thing and all this stuff happening in Eastern Europe and everything like that, we are going to see in 10 years, we'll hopefully know one way or the other what is the clear picture. It becomes more and more difficult to get a clear picture. I think there's a lot of bad actors telling us information, trying to convey information to us. And I think that we need to be careful about that beside that point. But besides that, there were new rising political groups. We had fascism, we had Nazism, right? And these two groups were clashing against each other in Germany. This is something that someone might argue that this is happening in the United States, but this was on a more wide scale. This was more prominent, okay? So so we have more communist types, and then we have groups that are more fascist types, I guess, in the United States. But we have communists rising up the United States who are more anarchist types who want the United States to be torn down and to be built up into a communist system. We actually have people doing that, but at the same time, we don't have it on a widespread scale. And those groups, from what we understand, aren't mobilizing political parties to try to take over parts of the country on a wide scale. The political groups, the political parties in the United States in general aren't radical. They aren't extremely radical. And you always get things thrown out, and the people of the United States aren't extremely radical. You always have radicals in a country. If you get a big enough group of people, you're going to have radical people in there. But if you go places in the United States, you go to a big city, People are people. They don't have the extreme political views in general. You go to a small town, people don't have extreme political views in general. Some people have this idea that the Midwest has extreme political views. It's not true. Most people in the Midwest don't care about politics. I would argue that most people in the Midwest are like centrists, and there's some people who are really into politics and some people who aren't really into politics. And even those people who are really into politics generally aren't people who are extreme in their political views. They are generally pretty mainstream within whatever party they're in. The thing about getting really radical, the thing about radicalizing an entire population is that people have to be willing to go in that direction. And the United States really doesn't like Nazism. The United States does not like Nazism. I've never met someone who is radically racist in my life, and I've met people who are racist. I've known people who they you talk to them and they'll say something about another race that's denigrating. It's like, oh, that's kind of gross. I don't like that. But at the same time, if you put them in a situation with a person of that race, they would be actually kind to that person. So they give lip service to this, oh, I don't like this type of person. I don't think they necessarily say, oh, I think they're lesser than me, but they say, I don't like this type of person. Let's just say that. But at the same time, in their actions, they're not going to act racism. And that's kind of weird, but at the same time, I've met probably less than five people maybe who are racist, but not racist in practice. Okay. And out of all the other people I've met, I've never met somebody who thinks, oh yeah, we should be racist. Oh yeah, we should follow Nazism. And like I said, I've lived in very small areas. I've lived in areas that are more suburbanish. I've lived in areas that are bigger cities. And I've never found it to be the case that there's a big, huge group of people in the United States who are like that. And if somebody said to me, oh, there's a lot of people, because I'm in Wisconsin, if people are like, oh, there's a lot of KKK members in Wisconsin, I'd be like, really? Because I've never heard of KKK members being in Wisconsin anywhere I've lived, anywhere I've been. And you would think you'd at least get like the rumor mill going, say, oh yeah, there's a KKK rally, whatever they do in this area of Wisconsin or that area of Wisconsin. I've never heard of it in my life. I've never heard of anybody talking about the KKK as a serious thing in the Midwest, right? I don't know about the South. I hear that it isn't the case, but I've never heard of that. I've never heard of somebody being radically racist. I've never met someone who is wants to be a Nazi. Everybody I know, and this is anecdotal evidence, but I think that statistically this is going to bear out if you do a study of the United States. I think you're going to find that people are very tolerant and very welcoming in general of people of other races, and you're probably going to have older people who aren't. But there isn't a move toward, how would I say this? There isn't a huge group of people who wants to subscribe to fascism. There isn't a huge group of people who wants to subscribe to Nazism. In general, most areas in the United States do not have clashes in the streets between these two groups of people. In some areas, you may have two political groups getting into violence with each other, but it doesn't happen on a wide scale over the entire country. Okay. And there are rising political groups, I would say, in the United States. I think there might be a turn, but at the same time, the central political groups that have had power for a long time, and will probably have it for a couple more decades at the very least. Another thing that is different about Germany compared to the United States, that Germany had a different political structure. The United States has a very specific political structure that keeps power away from a small group of people as well as it possibly can. Okay, so in Germany, it allowed Hitler to seize total power legally. The United States doesn't have a way in which you can do that legally, and if there is a possibility that you could seize power in the same way as Hitler, it would take a very long time because you would have to go through this long process of getting things passed. You'd have to get bills ratified. You'd actually have to change the laws to make that happen, and you'd have to change the laws very quickly, and you would have to I don't know if it would actually work. I just think there's too much variation in what people think, and I think that if you tried to do that, people would be like, no, we don't want this at all. I think there are some people who don't mind centralized governments controlling everything, but I think in general, the people of the United States would push back on that and be like, no, we don't want someone with complete control of what's going on here. Of course, I may be completely wrong, and there are always people who are voting who want strong men. But if you look at this, and like I said, you like Trump, you hate Trump, whatever. If you look at this, it doesn't match what was going on there. There may be a few things that line up, but at the same time, it doesn't match how things actually worked in that time period. And we need to actually match it up. And that's the whole point of going through this and showing you, hey, this isn't the same thing. Now, you might be somebody who is on the right and you're saying, yeah, of course, that's not the same thing. But you might be somebody on the left who thought, oh yeah, this is very similar to Nazi Germany, right? When Hitler was coming to power, this is how everything was working. It wasn't, and you might think Donald Trump is the worst thing that's ever happened to the United States. I disagree completely with that. There's a few things that are worse than Trump, a few things that are far worse than Trump in the United States. But you might think that, but at the same time, it's not following a pattern, and it's not in a position to do what happened to. Okay, it's not in a position where it's going to turn into what Germany was during World War II, at least not in the same way, because it doesn't have the same history, it doesn't have the same political structure, it doesn't have the same political milieu. It doesn't have the economic depression in the same way, all these different things. It doesn't have the same people group. It has a different set of ideas. There's a specific set of ideas that have been carried along by the German people because of German thinkers. And the United States is a very wide net of people with all these different ideas trying to come together and actually make something work. And it's going to play out differently. Is there ever going to be someone coming to power like Hitler to a certain degree in the United States? Maybe. But at the same time, it's not. The United States at this time, as far as I can see, is not primed to be suddenly overthrown and taken over by one individual. If you're going to look back to somebody, maybe you're going to look back to like the end of the Roman Republic. But at the same time, I don't actually have enough information to say, hey, this period of history we live in is really similar to this period of history that existed. But despite the muddiness of comparing history to today, it can help us predict the future, right? If a group of people did something in the past, for example, if you had slavery in the past, you can see, oh, that is not a good thing for humanity in general. It really doesn't work out. There's not really an economic benefit. Some people think that the South was upheld by slavery, but one thing that those people don't think is that if you are enslaved by somebody, you're not working as hard for that person than if you actually made money and you were a free agent to go and work where you would. You're going to slack off. You're not going to work as hard, even if you are whipped, and you're going to not like that person who owns you, especially if they don't treat you as well. So that's something we tried in the past that's pretty definitive that we see this isn't a good thing. Let's not have this. You actually do this in your own life with individual people who treat you poorly, where you test things out. So how this works is that you interact with somebody treats you like crap, you're like, well, I'm not going to talk to that person ever again, right? So we already do this kind of experimentation in our lives where we work things out. And we can do the same thing. We can do the same thing in our own lives. We can do the same thing in society in general. One thing that we've noticed is that people tend to shoot at presidents in the United States. So we beefed up security to try to limit presidents being shot. If you go anywhere where a president is going, they're going to have snipers on the roofs. They're going to have tons of security agents. They're not going to allow you near the president. They're going to have the car the president drives in. They're going to have 5,000 cars behind and in front of the president. They're going to block off all the roads and everything like that so the president can get through. I used to live in La Crosse, Wisconsin. When Obama came to town, it was the worst thing ever because you could not get anywhere, okay? La Crosse is stretched along the Mississippi River, and you can't get anywhere because they block off one of the two ways to get from the north to the south side of the city. I hated it. It was the worst thing ever. Seriously, the worst thing that could ever happen to somebody is being blocked off and having to take longer to get somewhere in traffic. If we find that a political party is really bad historically, maybe we shouldn't listen to that political party. If we find that a political party does something untoward, maybe we shouldn't listen to or trust that political party. Okay? Do your own research, make your own decisions on who you support politically. This isn't about politics, this is about history. it doesn't necessarily make us a prophet to know history, right? It could, depending on what we're studying and what we're looking into, but it gives us a broader perspective on reality. We understand how and why people do things instead of just a tertiary glance at, oh, this is what we see. We actually dive into why somebody did something. One thing I found out, going back to the rise and the fall of the Third Reich, is how normal Hitler was, right? He wasn't this, he did normal things, he interacted with people, and he was a human, and I've expressed that before, actually portray people as humans. It's a good thing to portray a human as a human, because if a human is evil, and I portray them as evil, I show that humans can be evil, right? If you have a human and they are evil, it's likely they have good personality traits that we would say are positive, but at the same time they're evil. We see, oh, they've done such a bad thing that this outweighs anything good they can do, but it shows that people can do evil things. So one thing I noticed is that when I was reading this book is that it shows how human Hitler was. It shows him that he was a person. Honestly, like he was a bum. He was a bum for a lot of his life, and then he got into politics, and then he slowly started getting more and more power, and he was just a person who was interacting and looking at the world in a specific way. It wasn't a good way, but he was a person. And that's something I learned when I was looking at that. I understood more, the decisions you're making, why are you doing those things? How are you doing those things? And then also, but beyond that, we understand the decisions that we now disagree with better. Okay? It is always good to understand another person's perspective. If you read widely about history, and if you read biographies, you notice, that person lived this specific type of life. They made these specific choices. This is the reason why they gave, why they made these choices. I understand that better, and it's very important to understand that better. It's good to actually not straw man people you disagree with. It's good to see, that person actually has reasons for how they do the things the way they do. And then you can have empathy for those people in the past, and you have less hubris in your present day. Hubris is just pride. It's a Greek word, I believe. It's just, if you're someone who's been in college, you've heard the word. It's just extreme pride, and it leads to a downfall somewhere. I think one thing that we often have in history is we have this idea that we're better than those in the past. And I don't think that's true. And I think that if you read history more widely, and I think if you dive into history, it shows you that people are people, and people have been people as long as there have been people. And you're not better than them. You exist in a different time period. Maybe you have more resources to do more than them, but you're not better than them. You're just in a different situation. And you don't know if you would make the same choices as them if you were put in that life they lived. And I think that one thing to remember as we look at history and we look at different perspectives in general is that we're small. There's 7 billion people on the planet, and there's been more than 7 billion people throughout history, right? Adding the present day and history together. And there are so many different perspectives, and I wonder how many perspectives actually match up between different people. And I think one thing that history helps us see is that the world has changed so much, and it isn't how it always has been. Like, it's different than it has been in the past, and it's good to know how it has been in the past. One of the reasons to know is that we can avoid mistakes that were made in the past, but another reason to know how it was in the past was so that we can incorporate good things from the past into our lives, and also see that we're part of a larger story. And I think it's good to be grateful. I think one thing that we seriously lack, and I think it's something I've been trying to do more in my life, is just show more gratitude, not just toward others in my life, but toward people that came before me, toward my parents. My parents made sacrifices so I could be in a specific place. And people who came before me made sacrifices. There's a proverb that says, wise men plant trees that they'll never sit under, right? They're never going to see these trees grow. They plan for the future of those who come after them. This is kind of an argument for having kids and being self-sacrificing with your kids. The world isn't going to get better if you just look out for yourself. You might do something that makes the world better, but I don't think the world's going to get better if you just look out for yourself. But I think that the world, and the lives of those around you are going to get better if you have somebody you care for. And you have to look into the future and you have to be like, what's the best I can do so that their lives aren't as difficult as mine? So they have a place to stand that's higher than where I was before. So they can stand on my shoulders and I actually push them forward instead of do something that holds them back. I've seen the effect of selfish parents, and I dislike selfish parents a lot. There's people who I've interacted with, seen, rub shoulders with, I guess. Not people I am friends with. I think that my friends who have children do an excellent job. But there's people I've seen that I'm like, you aren't looking out for your child's best interest. You are the first thing on your mind and your child's secondary. You're going to do whatever you want and satisfy your own desires. And then you're going to destroy your child's life for this. I've seen this happen. And I think that this is knowing history and understanding history and being grateful for the things that the people that came before us and built so much of what we have. I think it's really good to do that, because then we can see, oh, it is my responsibility to build for those coming after me. I actually have to sacrifice something. I have to do things differently so it's better for those coming after me. And I think one thing to remember is that when it comes to writing and when it comes to creating art, a real world exists when we're creating art. We are basing our art on the real world, whether or not we're writing about something real. And most of us aren't. Most of us are writing fiction. Some of us might be writing fantasy. It all comes back to the real world. It all comes back to truth. A real world exists. That world has rules. Not all perspectives are true. Talk to a 3-year-old. You'll realize not all perspectives are true. Hint, theirs is the one that isn't true. We are trying to understand what truth is, and not understanding something clearly is going to handicap the value of what you write. Okay? It is important to have truth embedded into what you write. It's important to reflect the world in a truthful way. And I've talked about truth in the past. I've talked about truthfulness. I've talked about truth in the past. And I think it's always important to get back to that idea of truth. There's always going to be a limit on our understanding, but we're always trying to reach toward that, and history is going to help us do that. One question before we go, and then we'll be done. What are we trying to understand from history? And as a writer, I think that we should focus on what is going to help our writing best. So that one thing that I think is going to help us fix our writing, make it better, make it more robust, make the meaning behind our writing better is people. I think it all comes down to people. We write to convey stories about people. So when we're looking at the past, we're trying to understand that human element. I am a broken record. I always talk about this, but the more I think about it, the more I think that art, that writing, that painting, whatever it is, this creative endeavor comes back to this human element. It's extremely important. We're trying to show our humanity through our writing. That's what it is. That's what we're trying to do. And I think that one of the best ways to do that is to look at the past, because we don't just, if we look around at the present, we only have our perspective. But if we look at the past, if we understand the past, if we understand the stories of those in our families or those around us and those who came before us, if we understand who they are, where they've been, why they've done what they've done, we understand specific elements of humanity better. But if we look into the past, if we look as far back as we can and understand as much as we can, we see those things that are static in human experience. We see how humans interact. We start to strip away all those extra things that come with being in our time period, being from our perspective, and we see, oh, humans have been the same throughout history, but there's some variation, but these are the things that have lasted. These are the things that we continue to do. These are the things that really seem to be at the core of humanity. Congratulations, you got to the end of my podcast. So you either had to listen to my voice or you had to listen to my voice and watch my face, which I don't envy you. Let's just say that. But if you're someone who likes this podcast and you're thinking, I'd like to support him in this podcast or the other creative things I'm doing, there's a few things you can do, because some people don't know what they can do to support people who create stuff. So these are the few things you can do that will really, really help me. First of all, check out my website. Check out the other things I'm doing. Second, comment on things, share them, like them, subscribe. Subscribe if you haven't already. And the third thing you can do is give reviews on different places, all right? So the biggest thing for this podcast is going on to iTunes, giving it an honest review, telling people why you like it, telling people why you hate my voice, why you hate my face, but telling people why they should really check it out, despite the fact that I have so many failings in terms of looks and voice. Other than that, if you want to check out my books, grab a copy of the book and listen to the serialized novel. Give digital copies away. That's a really big thing too. I always want to give you something that is valuable to you. I always want to give someone listening to this podcast something that's going to stick with them, or a book that they can actually own. And you can own that book for very, very cheap. So go check that out on Amazon. The different things I said: subscribe, upvote, comment, share, and definitely give it a review on iTunes. All right, as always, my name is Daniel Poppy, and this is How to Write Good.